will be that of the journey of Karbala and the journey of the human soul. So the title is this. We are going to be discussing over the next 10 days the two parallel journeys. Which two parallel journeys am I talking about? I'm talking about the journey of Karbala, of Imam Hussein, and I'm talking about the journey of our own soul and our own salvation. Why do I use the word parallel? And why do I say they are one of the same? We will touch upon that in a few minutes. However, first, inshallah, for a few minutes, what I would like to discuss is to what degree are we actually understanding what the purpose of these majalis are when we take a macroscopic view and look at it from a bird's eye perspective. What are we actually taking away from this? When I have interactions with the shabab, with the youth, we have conversations and we discuss. And a lot of the rhetoric that comes back to me is we are simply in the majalis because our parents told us to. They listen to the majalis like me and you every year. They say we are simply here because we are forced to. We are simply here because it's part of the culture. We are simply here, we know that the message is important and it's a good one. However, the purposes of the majalis themselves, it's entirely up in the air. So therefore, as a, inshallah, reminder to ourselves, and just to put some sort of a metric and mark in regards to where we need to go and what direction we need to head in, we see that the purpose of these majalis, of course, are very clear. We don't want them to turn into some sort of dogmatic analysis, where we listen, we comprehend, and we move on. But rather we see that the message of Imam Hussein has a deeper purpose. And that deeper purpose, which we will touch upon, has been written to us in his will to his brother, Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiyyah. Inshallah, before I begin with the words of the Imam, can we have a salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad? In the words of the Imam himself, he states that the purpose of my stand, the purpose of me doing this, as you have all heard every single year, and as a reminder to ourselves, is for what reason? He states to his brother, I am taking this stand neither out of mischief nor out of injustice. I am taking this stand for three particular reasons. The first of which we understand, Amr bil Ma'ruf. The second of which we understand, Nahi anil Munkar. And the third of which is the basis of all of the majalis of Aba Abdullah al-Hussein, is the reformation of the ummah of my grandfather, he states. So therefore, this is the only thing that we need to keep in mind when we are listening to these lectures. This is the only thing that we need to bear in mind when we are listening to the musibah. This is the only thing that we need to bear in mind when we are partaking in the processions of Muharram and of Arba'een. Because we see that it's not simply marking a date. It's not simply marking a ceremony, but rather it's reformation of the self. Therefore, all of the individuals, young and old, whoever it may be, would benefit from the understanding that the purposes of these majalis is the reformation of the self. So therefore, when we leave the lecture today, when we leave the processions, when we leave any sort of commemoration of Aba Abdullah al-Hussein, I ask myself the very clear question, to what degree have I reformed myself? And to what degree have I held true to the message of Aba Abdullah al-Hussein? Only if I have improved, only if I have taken by his example, only if I have learned, only if I have loved, only if I have suffered, only if I have gone through pain to some degree as they have, can I truly say that I have reformed. Therefore, in that vein, our series commences. And in that vein, we move forward with our understanding. The two parallel journeys of the human soul and of Karbala itself. So I would like you to think of it in this manner. Think of a coin. A coin has two sides, correct? One side of the coin is the journey of the human soul, and the other side of the coin is the journey of Aba Abdullah al-Hussein. And when we ask the question, what is it about this sacrifice that makes it so ubiquitous? What is it about this sacrifice that makes it so universal? Why is it when we look at the sacrifice of all of the other ma'asumeen, when we look at all the tragedies that occurred in mankind, why have none of them survived the test of time? However, when we look at the message of Imam Hussein, something keeps our hearts alive. Something keeps our hearts moving. Something allows us to understand that there's something deeper within inside this. That depth of dimension in the story of Aba Abdullah al-Hussein is the fact that it corresponds with the journey of the human soul. We see, as I mentioned, two sides of the same coin. Each step in the journey of Aba Abdullah al-Hussein corresponds directly to each step in our journey of the human soul. We see that it starts, for example, when the soul was created. The soul was created, and of course, we see the event termed as the mithaq. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Holy Quran, He tells us that I created the soul. And I created the soul and I asked you, am I not your Lord? Alastu bi rabbikum? And all of you responded with what? Every single individual in this room, every single individual listening, they all responded unilaterally. And that unilateral response was what? قَالُوا بَلَى شَهِدْنَا. They accepted and they testified. They said, most verily you are our Lord. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala completes the verse with a very interesting turn of phrase. He says, now none of you have the right on Yawm al-Qiyamah to come to me and say that you did not know. Now none of you have the right to come to me when all is said and done and said that we were in the veils of ignorance, we were in ghafla, we were engaged in sin, we didn't seek the truth, we didn't possess the truth, and we did not have the truth. So we see here that the correlation between the tragedy of Aba Abdullah al-Hussein and the human soul are one of the same. And each step of the journey of Aba Abdullah al-Hussein corresponds with each step of the journey of the human soul. So we will start where Imam Hussein's journey started, when he left Medina. We will end where Imam Hussein's journey ended, when he was on the plains of Karbala. Now, the parallel journey that we will be following is that we will start when the soul itself was created, and we will end when our soul needs to return back to our Lord. Each night, inshallah, we will cover a particular step in the journey of Aba Abdullah al-Hussein, and we will see how that corresponds to the journey of our soul, so that we know what it means of how to become insan kamil, so that we know what it means how to actually follow the path of truth and return back to the divine, so that we can actually see that what Karbala is and what the tragedy of Imam Hussein is in essence, it's a roadmap to Kamal. It's a roadmap to perfection. It's a roadmap to salvation. And if we simply follow the stories and the essences behind them, simply and listening to them, reading them, and not understanding them, we would see each particular stage and each particular story has depth that correlates to the journey of our own soul. So on that basis, we start with the first step today. And we start with the first stage today. And that, of course, as I mentioned, is the creation of the soul. Can we have a salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad? When we look at the creation of the soul, respected brothers and sisters, we see that our life's journey is that of pursuit, is that of seeking. We are in universities because we want to gain knowledge. We are in the majalis because we want to seek something. However, as I mentioned a few minutes earlier, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala points us in the direction of something very interesting. He states that you have started with certainty. We don't start with doubt, and we don't start with shak, and we don't start with then, but rather we start with yaqeen. He says, I created you in a form and I created you in a manner where you started with yaqeen and you started with certainty. Therefore, how does this change our set of affairs? And how does this change our understanding? We see that instead of our life's journey becoming the pursuing of something that we do not possess, we see rather the purpose of our life is to reawaken something that already exists within inside us. The certitude that exists within inside us is what we are trying to reawaken. The yaqeen that exists within inside us is what we are trying to bring back to light. This is something we already have. This is something we already possess. However, as we understand through the veils of sin and through the veils of heedlessness, this possession of certainty that we have can become clouded and can become shrouded. Therefore, if we shift our paradigm now entirely, that we were in the darkness and now we are in the light, rather we understand that we were in the light and we are now taking ourselves into the darkness. We were in the light and now we are taking ourselves into heedlessness. We were in the light and now we are taking ourselves into sin and disarray. Understanding that paradigm and understanding that perspective, we now see that what we are seeking, rather, as I mentioned, is a reawakening. When we do the adhkar, when we read the dua, we see this is not us trying to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but rather this is us trying to remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Semantically, when we look at the word dhikr itself, what does it mean? It means to remember, does it not? It means to recall. So therefore, when we look at what our actual responsibility is, we say that we possess this certainty. We started off with this certainty. We knew what the truth was, and now we need to move forward with our journey. Therefore, if I understand that I possess this truth that I so dearly seek, I possess this certainty that I am looking for, now I understand that I have direction in my life. And now I understand that I have meaning in my life. We see this ties in very importantly to the concept of fitrah. The verse I mentioned at the end of the khutbah was فِطْرَةَ اللَّهِ الَّتِي فَطَرَ النَّاسَ عَلَيْهِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala eloquently mentions, He states that the fitrah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is within inside each and every human being. So it's because of this fitrah we yearn for beauty. It's because of this fitrah we understand injustice when we see it. It's because of this fitrah that we understand that pain is something we need for our development. It's because of this fitrah that we actually crave for meaning. We see that atheists, non-atheists, religious, non-religious, whatever it may be, we are all craving for meaning, are we not? We're all craving for direction. We're all craving for purpose. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that I gave this to you with certainty. Certainty. And it exists within inside you. That's why you incline in a certain direction. That's why you are pushed in a certain direction. Therefore, my first responsibility becomes what? My first responsibility becomes I need to trust my intuitions. How much have I actually spent sitting alone on myself, trying to contemplate the nature of what's true? Because I think we will be the first ones to tell ourselves that we usually know what's right and we usually know what's wrong. However, we usually react on either reactionary basis or a polemical basis. We provide any sort of justification that we can for what it is that we want to do. But how much time have we actually spent sitting in silence in our virtual caves of Hiraz and actually gave some time and thought in regards to what we believe to be true, in what we believe to be right? This action that I am doing, this conversation that I am engaging in, this path that I have taken, my relationship with my family, my relationship with my spouse, my relationship with my children. All of these aspects of akhlaq, we ask ourselves the question, to what degree am I actually asking myself these questions genuinely? Because as I mentioned, we understand that we have the answers within inside us, we have the certainty within inside us. قَالُوا بَلَى, we already testified to the facts that we have knowledge of the truth and we have knowledge of our Lord. So therefore, on a contemplative theme, how much time have we actually spent asking ourselves, is what I'm doing right? Is what I'm doing true? Is what I'm doing just? Therefore, when we look at the social lens and the social perspective, this becomes ever more important. Is what I'm doing true? Is what I'm doing right? Is what I'm doing just? When we look at the situation in the world right now, socially and politically, as I said, it's very easy for us to polemically respond. It's very easy for us to respond in reaction. However, to what degree are we actually responding after contemplation, after thought, in the certainty that we possess? And again, this can be extrapolated on any device of the truth, whether it's the social sphere, whether it's the internal sphere. Whatever it is that it may be, we can see that the answers are all there within inside us. According to the verse of the Holy Quran where He says, أَلَسْتُ بِرَبِّكُمْ? Am I not your Lord? And we all unilaterally responded with yes. Therefore, we need to give ourselves more credit and we need to give ourselves more time for the truth that exists within inside us. We need to allow ourselves to channel the certainty that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created and coded us with, so that we can get to the answers of the questions that we are speculating about. We all have doubts, which is natural. We all have confusions, which is natural. However, we see that the only way that you can get rid of doubt and the only way that you can get rid of these confusions is by tapping in to that yaqeen and certainty that exists within each and every one of us. Therefore, that being said, the point of the mithaq and the fitrah has been mentioned, that there exists at the beginning of the soul's journey this creation, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala within inside the very creation of our soul has stated that I have given you this certainty and I have given you this yaqeen. And we see that that is the point that marks the beginning of the spiritual journey of the soul. As I mentioned, it's going to be a parallel journey. What point of the journey of Imam Hussein corresponds to the point of the creation of the soul? We see it's the very start of his journey when he sets out from Medina. The story is an interesting one and it has many parallels from which we can take lessons. And we see that the remembrance of Aba Abdullah al-Hussein is something that has been emphasized time and time again for this very reason. The universality of it. They are telling us, the Ma'sumin, time and time again, that there lies within inside this tragedy stories of your own soul's salvation. What Karbala is a microcosm of your life. If you simply look at the tragedy of Karbala, you have a roadmap, as I mentioned. You have a guide to attain the truth and the salvation that you are seeking. We have a tradition from Imam Baqir, salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad, where he states that the birds, the ajinna, the malaik, the humans and the animals, they all mourned the tragedy of Aba Abdullah al-Hussein. They all wept for him. And they all expressed grief and sadness for him. Again, we understand that this grief and sadness is a means for us to attain and understand something higher. This grief and this sadness is a means for us to actually comprehend something greater. We don't limit it to the grief and the sadness, but rather we understand that this grief and sadness is a wasila for me to understand that within inside this tragedy are the seeds to my growth, and within inside this tragedy are the seeds to my development. So as I mentioned, how does the first stage of the human's journey correspond to the first step of Imam Hussein's sacrifice? We see that the historians tell us, in the opinion of Ray Shahri and others, that there was a point in time when we go to the era of Imam Hussein, where we saw the death of Muawiyah. And at the point of the death of Muawiyah, we see that Yazid, being as politically savvy as he was, he wanted to consolidate the oaths before word actually got out. So he sent a letter to his governor of Medina, Al-Walid, and he states to his governor of Medina that I would like you to get the oaths of everyone before news of this actually spreads. However, primarily you need to get the oath of the seniors in Quraysh, and specifically I want the oath of Hussein ibn Ali. Therefore, Al-Walid at this point in time, as you all know the story, he sends individuals to go and summon Imam Hussein. Imam Hussein was sitting in a mosque at this particular point in time. When he was sitting in this mosque, and it was a very odd hour, he was summoned to the court of Al-Walid. When he was summoned to his court, he of course had an inkling of what it was about. When his companions asked him, what do you think this is? He says, most verily, the death of Muawiyah has now occurred, and they will be asking me to come and swear allegiance. Imam Hussein rose and he went with a group of his companions. He told them to wait at the door. He said, if I signal to you, you come in. If you hear some commotion, you come in. Up until that point, you do not have permission, and you must allow me to converse with them. They said, Aba Abdullah, there's a concern, there's a security concern. If you go in, something will happen to you. He said, the instructions have been given. So he went in, and there, of course, in front of him was Al-Walid and, of course, Marwan ibn Hakam. These two individuals are there, and they are now demanding the allegiance, and they are demanding the oath of Aba Abdullah al-Hussein. When they are demanding this allegiance and they are demanding this oath, Imam Hussein says, this is something that is an impossibility for me, and I will be unable to do this. Now the historical accounts differ in regards to what actually happened. However, where they are all anonymous is that Imam Hussein left without pledging allegiance, and him and his companions went back to their houses. When they went back to their houses, an interesting episode occurred. Marwan ibn Hakam went to Imam Hussein the next morning and said, listen, Hussein ibn Ali, I want the best for you. Listen to the vocabulary and listen to the rhetoric. I want the best for you. I want what's good for you. Have we not heard this before on an international sphere? Have we not heard this before? Politically speaking, I want what's good for you. I want khair for you. In this life and in the next, he states to Imam Hussein. He states that I would like you, of course, to pledge allegiance to Yazid. I would like you to give your oath and give your fealty so that you can have the khair in this world and the khair in the akhirah. What did Imam Hussein respond with? He said that if I do not want the death of Islam, I can't surrender. If I do not want the death of Islam, I can't pledge allegiance to an individual of the likes of Yazid ibn Muawiyah. Marwan reportedly then left furious, and Imam Hussein is now in a position of contemplation. What to do and where to go. How can he tap into this certainty that we spoke about a few minutes ago? How can he tap into this yaqeen that he already possesses? He went to the grave of his grandfather, Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alih. He went to the grave of his grandfather, and the reports dictate that he was in the position of sujood and he fell into a light sleep. When he fell into a light sleep, he then had an audience with the Holy Prophet himself, and the Holy Prophet then explained to him the entirety of what was to come, of what was to happen when he left Medina, of what was to happen when he arrived in Kufa, of what was to happen when he went to Karbala. All of these points were mentioned, and all of these points were raised. Imam Hussein then came out of this state and still at the grave of the Holy Prophet. He gave his salam and he bade him farewell. He went to his family and he bade them farewell. Now he wrote the will that we spoke about a few minutes earlier to Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiyyah, where he states that I take this stand neither out of mischief nor out of injustice. I'm doing this for the reasons that I have mentioned. And this will is of the most beautiful wills that you would read. He first testifies the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then he testifies on the risala of the Holy Prophet, and then he speaks about the importance of believing in the last day, and he speaks about the importance of enjoining the good, and he speaks about the importance of forbidding the evil. He writes this, he bids farewell to his family, and then he starts on his journey away from Medina towards the next stage. As I mentioned, how does this stage correspond with the first stage of the journey of the human soul? Imam Hussein's journey started with certainty. Imam Hussein's journey started with yaqeen, did it not? He started his journey knowing full well what was going to happen to him. He started his journey with 100% certitude that if I embark upon this, there will be pain, and there will be suffering, and there will be torment, and my family will be in agony too. He began with certainty. However, what did he do? Did he allow this to draw him away? Or did he allow this to propel him further? Did he allow this to become an area of shak and doubt? Or did he allow it to become a means for him to actually get closer to what the yes was? So when we recount our lives, respected brothers and sisters, we need to ask ourselves the question, to what degree are we answering the yes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? When he states, Alastu bi rabbikum, and we all said, Qalu bala. To what degree are we being consistent with this oath that we pledged? To what degree are we being consistent with this statement that we mentioned, that we truly understand that He is the Lord? We truly understand that we have the certainty of what the truth is. Now, to what degree are we actually allowing this to take place in our life? He tapped into the certainty that he possessed so that he can move further in his life. Now, we ask ourselves the question, to what degree are we tapping into the certainty that we possess so we can move further in our lives? We might be placed in difficult situations. If you're struggling with an addiction, if you're struggling in a toxic relationship, if you're struggling in regards to your work, or if you're struggling in regards to your family, you would see that the human experience is that of pain and the human experience is that of suffering. And we see this is something we accept and uphold. However, understanding this virtue of starting with certitude, however, still moving forward with what it is that we are supposed to do, how are we actually using this yaqeen to leave this addiction? How are we actually using this yaqeen to leave heedlessness? How are we actually using this yaqeen to leave the sin that we are engaging into? The same way Imam Hussein used that yaqeen to do and move forward with the action that he knew to be true, to what degree are we using our certainty that we possess, fitratan, within inside each and every one of us, to leave these difficulties that we are in and head in the right direction? To what degree? And again, it comes back to our previous point of contemplation. Have we actually even thought about it? Have we actually even understood what the truth is and where the truth stands? And if we have, then we must move forward. As I mentioned, it can't be on a polemical basis. It can't be on a reactionary basis. That I am doing this for that reason. And we would see that we spend most of our lives in reaction, do we not? We spend most of our lives with something happening to us and we simply respond to that. However, we see through the example of Imam Hussein alayhi salam that our responsibility is to be proactive and take initiative in the direction and work upon the certitude and the certainty that we have, and the certitude and the certainty that we already possess. Now, speaking of the certitude and certainty that we already possess, we now take ourselves to the relevance of the current day. As I mentioned, upon the advice of all of the maraja and their officers, the purpose of these discussions is to make them relevant and to see what our taklif is regarding this. We spoke about the fitrah, did we not? And we spoke about how we have a base inclination that yearns for beauty. And we have a base inclination that tells us that injustice is wrong. Now, speaking about this injustice, we see, looking at the state of the world right now, that an inclination in the hearts of many would be that the injustice that is occurring is wrong. The injustice that is occurring is incorrect. The injustice that is occurring is something that goes against that certainty of truth that lives and exists within inside us. If we have this certainty, and if we have this now discomfort, this cognitive dissonance, so to speak, that our heart desires one thing and reality reflects another, our fitrah requires one thing and the social sphere is showing another, we see that through the example of Imam Hussein, we now need to take some sort of direction in regards to what our taklif is. The primary discussion is on unity. That many claims are made that when we look at the importance of unity, no one is going to understate this in the religion of Islam. And if you do, then we would say that you're understudied, correct? When we look at the importance of the unity of the ummah, inna hadhihi ummatukum ummatan wahida, correct? We see that the importance of the unity of the ummah is preserved in the religion of Islam. So we see that we must make sure that the ummah of the Holy Prophet himself is maintained. When we talk about unity with Ahl Kitab, I ask you, is this not spoken about in the Quran? The Quran speaks about the unity of Ahl Kitab. And it speaks about the importance of collaboration. When we talk about the unity of individuals who are not Muslim, I ask you, is it not a tradition of Ali ibn Abi Talib, salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad, where he states that people are of two types, your brothers in faith or your equals in humanity. So we see that this repetition of unity is there, and this importance placed upon unity is there. However, the question still remains, what is our responsibility when my fitrah feels this discomfort in regards to the social injustices that are happening around me? Do I now work in collaboration? Do I now work in unification? Do I now work in bringing everything together? Do I now work in compromise? That's the question we need to answer, right? Do I do this or do I not? So that my fitrah is reflective of the reality, and that rather the reality is reflective of my fitrah. We see that the answer to this question is given to us very clearly by Aba Abdullah al-Hussein. And the answer is given to us on the 10th of Muharram, on the day of Ashura. In the sermon that we all know very well, we see that Imam Hussein teaches us a very important lesson. He says that unity is integrally important. Discussions are integrally important. Collaboration is integrally important. However, compromise, unacceptable. Compromise of your principles, unacceptable. Compromise of your beliefs are unacceptable. Therefore, when we look at what the Islamic position is, we see that in the words of Aba Abdullah al-Hussein, he states very eloquently and very clearly, he states that you are giving me two choices, one of drawing the sword and two of humiliation. And my answer to you is very clear, and that is hayhat min ad-dilla. My answer to you is that never to humiliation. When we look at what's happening right now, I ask you, is this not humiliation? When we look at the murder of women, is this not humiliation? When we look at the murder of children, is this not humiliation? When we look at the state of the ummah right now, is this not humiliation? Therefore, when we look at what the Husseini approach is, we see that it's incredibly clear. We see that when it comes to unity and union and collaboration, it must be observed. However, when it comes to the humiliation of the people around us, we see hayhat is the answer to this. There is absolutely no room for compromise when there is humiliation occurring to the individuals around us. Therefore, that's being understood. We need to make sure that our approach is in this methodology. Our approach is in this manhaj that we see. Imam Hussein mentioned quite eloquently. He said, I have two choices, to draw the sword or humiliation. And focus upon the vocabulary here. He didn't choose the sword. He said, I have two choices. Either I can draw the sword or humiliation. What did he choose? Never to humiliation. He didn't necessarily directly choose the sword, which is something that we need to spend some time on. There's nuance to this, right? We need to understand what's the correct approach to make sure we do not fall in humiliation? What's the correct approach to make sure that the sanctity of the human life is being preserved around us? This itself is a discussion. But we see Imam Hussein had the integrity and he had the hikmah to understand that drawing the sword itself primarily is something that is not what we agree to. However, what he did know for a fact was humiliation is something that's unacceptable. Humiliation is something that does not come within the dictionary definition of what it means to be a Shia. So understanding this basis, we see that the importance of spirituality is there. The importance of the esoteric dimensions of Islam is there. I'm not denouncing this. I'm not rebuking this. However, I ask you, what spirituality is there without social awareness? What spirituality is there without social responsibility? I ask you, did the Holy Prophet spend the entirety of his life in the cave and not attend to the issues of the people in Mecca? And not attend to the trials and tribulations of the individuals in Medina? Was he simply spending time in spirituality and contemplation? Or did he understand that this spirituality and contemplation resonates with an aspect of the truth within inside me, this yaqeen within inside me, the certainty within inside me that compels me to make sure that if I cannot stop the injustice that are happening around me, I must at least speak about it. And if I can't speak about the injustices that are happening around me, I must at least have it within inside my heart. We have this tradition, do we not? From Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi. Where he sees, if you see an injustice, you stop it with your hand. If you're unable to do that, you stop it with your tongue. And if you're unable to do that, make sure you keep it within inside your heart. However, understand this is the lowest level and form of Iman. So we see that the nuances of the response, that requires a conversation. The nuances of the response, that requires some dialogue. What is our specific political philosophy that resonates with this yaqeen and certainty that we responded with after Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala stated, Alastu bi rabbikum? What this specific thing is, as I mentioned, again, requires contemplation and thought. Deep thinking. What is the actual truth? Forget your environment, forget your mosque. Forget everything. Just sit and think, what is the truth? What is my taklif? And what is the wadhifa? As I mentioned, the answers of all of this exist within inside us the same way Imam Hussein used this certainty to take the huge risk of leaving his family, members of them, taking his family, members of them, and embarking on this one-way journey to what he knew the solution was going to be. However, he was very comfortable in his decision. Why? Because he acted upon certainty. Therefore, on that note, we understand what our taklif is as Shia, and what our taklif is as individuals is firstly to seek and to understand what the proponents and the tenets of our belief are, have certainty within inside them, and after that we garner direction. Why is it one day we move here and another day we move there? Because we haven't sat with ourselves, we haven't thought, we haven't actually unraveled that certainty that exists within inside us. And the moment we do, we see that the veils start to separate. The truth becomes apparent. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Holy Quran, He says that your responsibility is simply to have taqwa. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, I will separate the veils of truth and falsehood for you. I will make everything apparent for you. You simply make sure that you maintain the self-discipline. You simply make sure that you maintain this self-restraint, this taqwa that we have defined. Therefore, when we look at, as I mentioned, the tenets of our ideological beliefs, we need to look inside and we need to look externally. سَنُرِيهِمْ آيَاتِنَا فِي الْآفَاقِ وَفِي أَنفُسِهِمْ. We need to look at this dual dimensional basis, and then we can get to where we actually are. So the first stage of our journey, inshallah, concludes there, as we have now run out of our time, where we see that our parallel journey of the human soul and our parallel journey of the tragedy of Aba Abdullah al-Hussein shows us that if we follow each step of Imam Hussein's sacrifice diligently, within inside each step we will find some sort of direction in regards to how to perfect our own soul. And we see that these are 10 steps towards becoming an insan kamil. These are 10 steps towards becoming a perfected human being. This is 10 steps towards becoming an individual who purifies their soul And this is 10 steps towards becoming an individual like Aba Abdullah al-Hussein in his 10th and final step, where he was prostrated on the lands of Karbala in a total utter state of taslim, where we, inshallah, in the final stage of the human soul's journey, hope to be, inshallah, prostrated in a state of taslim. Our discussion comes to an end, and inshallah we will have the musibah commencing now. So I do encourage everybody to remain seated so we may inshallah benefit from the upcoming musibah. We see that the tragedy and the sacrifice of Aba Abdullah al-Hussein didn't stay alive through the lectures, but rather they stayed alive through the poetry and through the recitation of the musibah. So allow yourselves to inshallah feel the grief, the pain, the suffering, so that we may reform ourselves, transform ourselves, and reconnect to this inner certainty that we all do possess. وآخر دعوانا والحمد لله رب العالمين صلوات على محمد وآله الطاهرين.